Welcome to the FAFSA Leadership Lounge, where we dive into the policies shaping the work of Florida's school leaders. I'm Jeff Willoughby, filling in for Michelle White this week, and I'm the Policy and Programs Manager for the Florida Association of School Administrators.
And I'm Jessica Janasiewicz, lobbyist for FAFSA and several school districts around the state of Florida.
All right. Well, Florida's regular session has been over for about a week now. So the big question on everyone's mind is, what's next?
That's right. We know one thing for sure. Lawmakers will have to come back to Tallahassee, and they will probably come back for a couple things. But one thing we know for sure is they will come back on April 20th for a special session on redistricting. This special session was actually scheduled back in January when Governor DeSantis requested it after President Trump was asking states to look and overhaul their maps and try to make sure that they are the most favorable for Republicans. And so DeSantis kind of answered the call of the president and called that special session for this mid-April date.
All right. Well, generally redistricting occurs once a decade, when the census numbers get updated. Florida last renewed its congressional map in 2022. Now, whether the lawmakers are going to agree to redraw this map is just another question in itself. House Speaker Daniel Perez convened a special committee on redistricting this year, but the Senate has done nothing on the issue so far.
Which that sounds about right for this year. There's
Right?
not much happening. But I will say, just to harken back to last session in 2025, the governor did call a special session. I think that was about immigration and some other issues. And you may recall that the legislature gavelled in and then immediately gavelled out. So just because he calls a special session doesn't necessarily mean that they have to actually take action. So just as you said, we'll see what they actually do when it comes to an actual work product. The big question that is on all of our minds for planning purposes is, of course, the budget. As we mentioned in the past, the only thing the legislature has to do each year is pass a budget, and that is the one thing that they didn't do during this session. And for the second year in a row, we have finished session without a budget. So the budget has to be approved and signed into law before the beginning of the new fiscal year, which for our state is July 1st, in order to avoid any government shutdown.
That's right. And what do they say? You had one job. And I have some other thoughts on that, but we will talk about it another time. But that is true. And a special session for the budget really hasn't been scheduled yet. However, there are some rumors that they're going to get a little tricky here and return right around the April 20th redistricting session to work on the budget.
That's right. And if that were to happen, they would probably come a few days before the redistricting session, come to an agreement on the budget. Then you may recall that we've talked about how the budget is required to cool off or rest for 72 hours so that they could have the budget that they agree on rest and work on redistricting during that period of time. And then they could vote on the budget and vote on any maps that they approve and send both to the governor.
Well, that sounds pretty easy and efficient. And I'm just going to take a quick aside here, Jessica. The thing that baffles me about this rumor is they had 60 days to figure out a budget, and they think they can come up for like 2 or 3 days, blow one out, and let it cool for 72 hours. I mean, come on, give me a break.
It's right.
We'll see what happens.
If they were to do it, what that would really mean is that the vast majority of the work would be done before they got up here, and there would be even less public input than what we currently have. So, that's not the best way to probably operate, if you're trying to be open in public about these things. But you're right. I mean, they really couldn't do the actual work in 2 or 3 days. It's just impossible. So that would have to happen when they're back at home and maybe having conversations, theoretically.
Exactly. And we'll see what happens. Now, there's also talk about another special session which addresses property taxes. This, of course, was a huge topic in the regular session. There were 7 bills filed with varying amounts of property tax relief, and really nothing happened with all that. And that's a big issue for the governor.
That's exactly right. So, we really, that if there was a theme for this legislative session, it certainly was that we would have a lot of action on one issue in one chamber and the other one would seemingly totally ignore it and vice versa. And that's exactly what happened on property taxes. The House filed a number of bills. They actually had one that went all the way through the House and passed on the floor, which would have completely phased out all non-education property taxes. So we technically, school districts would not have been impacted because they would continue to collect that portion of the tax. But local governments were certainly very concerned about that proposal because just completely eliminating them would really, really hurt their budgets. That at least was the argument that we heard from the Senate and the reason in their mind that they did not take that bill up this session.
That's true. And here's an interesting thing about all of this, the property tax relief special session. The governor, wants to call a special session to do it in July or August during the Republican primary season. That seems a little tricky for the folks who are running for office, but that's a different story. He also said it would put pressure on lawmakers who may not like what the governor proposes. Just another wrinkle here is the deadline under the Constitution, the Florida Constitution, to propose an amendment is more than 90 days before an election. So it needs to be done before August 4th to be able to hit the ballot.
So that really, kind of compresses that timeline, as you said. And certainly we saw that the House passed some rules that would allow them, if they have already scheduled a fundraising event during what then ends up being a special session, that they can continue to have that event. You may recall that legislators are barred from raising money during session. So now the House and the Senate both have these different rules for special sessions that would allow them, if something like that were to happen, if you were to bring legislators here in July, let's say, they could technically still raise money if they already had something scheduled. But what they couldn't do is be at home and, knocking on doors, waving at, on the corner with their signs and those kinds of things, which is very important for them to be able to do. That's how they get, that face ID and the name ID that they need when they go for an election. So it certainly, would impact them, to be sure. And then the final special session that's been discussed, so it does seem unlikely that it would happen, is the medical freedom special session. So the governor suggested recently that there was a possibility that lawmakers could come back to Tallahassee to pass a budget that would remove all vaccine mandates from state law. This was a priority from DeSantis during the regular session. They had a bill that, wait for it, passed the Senate, but didn't even get a hearing in the House. Another one of our patterns. So we'll see if that actually happens. Obviously, what the message we got from that during the regular session is that the House did not have any desire to do that, but things can change. And on a side note to this, last week, a federal judge temporarily blocked federal health officials from cutting vaccines recommended for children. So the Trump administration has said they're going to appeal that decision, but that's another part of this that still remains in play. And as for the governor, the strike against the federal government's effort on these vaccine requirements is another, kind of blow to his call for ending the mandatory vaccines, because if they end up doing something on the federal level, they don't really need to do anything at the state level.
That's right. And I mean, like you said, that special session does not seem like it's too likely. And there were some news stories that came out at the time of this recording today that really kind of put that one to bed. So, but we'll still see. You never know. Stranger things have happened. And you mentioned a minute ago about fundraising for elections. Well, let's talk about the elections coming up here in the fall. So this fall, Florida is going to elect a new governor, as well as a lot of other offices, including state and federal representatives, senators, agriculture commissioner, attorney general, I think is up there. CFO, there's a bunch. We're going to have a big, thick ballot this year.
Yes.
This is a funny, interesting thing. A story came out last week that had a listing of everyone who's running for office. So everybody who's filed. And currently there are 42 people running for governor.
Isn't that just crazy? I'm always shocked, when you ultimately get the ballot there are usually a number of names that you haven't heard. There's usually the top people, but there's not. Not thankfully 42, and the reason for that is candidates do have to qualify in order to be on that primary ballot. So a great number of those people who have filed to run will not qualify for one reason or another, but still,
Sure.
it will end. That's a large number of people who put their name in to run, and then
And
in
it's funny.
addition to that, oh, sorry.
Sorry, I'm just going to tell you, it's funny looking through these people. There'd be the well-known name people, and it would say, U.S. Congressperson, and they're from this city or whatever. And then there'd be some people, their description would say Tampa resident.
Right.
What? Okay.
Who are these people? It really is quite interesting. And when you think about a state like Florida, it is very expensive to run for state office in this state because we have, these large media markets where putting ads on TV and things like that are very expensive. And so it's really unrealistic and unlikely that anybody who's just kind of doing it on their own would be able, to mount any kind of real campaign. But there's still folks trying, so we'll see. I bet we won't have 42 ultimately that are running at the primary, but we shall see. And then, of course, for us here at the state level, we also have our House of Representatives. They are elected every 2 years. So what that means is all of those seats are up for office. They don't really ever get a break from running, folks in the House. So all 120 seats are up for election. And the state Senate, where we have 40 members, 20 of them will be up, of those seats will be up for election. And then when we're looking at the House, of that 120 seats, 89 have incumbents that are running. So there's going to be quite a few new faces, and the same thing with the Senate. We have more seats up there and more incumbents running. So it should be a very interesting election year, to be sure.
Yes. I mean, 31 new potential representatives. That I don't think I've ever heard of that many coming in at one time. That's a lot.
Big class. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, speaking of elections, tomorrow on the 24th, Tuesday, we're going to have a special session to fill a state Senate seat.
That's right. So this special election was called to fill the state Senate seat that was vacated by our current Lieutenant Governor, Jay Collins. He had been serving in the state Senate. Governor DeSantis asked him to serve as lieutenant governor, so his seat was then empty. The governor then called this special election. Now, you'll note this is after the legislative session, so this person theoretically may not have very much to do, but of course we do expect a special session. So if they're elected, they will be there for that. Who's running in that seat? Well, we have current Representative Josie Tonko, who some of our listeners may recall that name. She, at one point in her time in the House, was our appropriations chairman in the House of Representatives for education. So we have, of course, worked with her. She is running, and her opponent is a gentleman named Brian Nathan. What has been even more interesting about this race is her opponent has questioned whether or not she actually lives in this district. So her current House seat, which she will have to resign to run, so she's resigned, she won't, but she waited until after the session to resign so that way she could serve in the House during the legislative session. Her current seat is a Polk County seat. This particular state Senate seat is a Hillsborough County seat. She has a home that is a residence in Polk County. That's how she's represented there. And her husband lives in Hillsborough. So the opponent has said, where do you live? Do you live in Polk or do you live in Hillsborough? So there's been some kind of issues there that have been, part of this campaign. Another interesting thing with this seat is it is also one of those that would be up for election this year. So this individual, whomever wins, will serve and then we'll have to run again almost immediately. So theoretically, you could have someone win this seat here in March and then lose in the fall and have somebody else there, which is just kind of a crazy turn of events. So we'll have to keep watching that one to be sure we come back with the results for that for next week.
Wow, that is crazy. Now, how does that residency work? I would assume that if she's married to somebody who lives in Hillsborough County, that's could be her residence.
Yeah, so you have to have an official residence and then you, in some way, have to prove, at some point, at least when you're running, I think that is where your primary, place of residence is. Because certainly, we know people have second homes. Maybe you got a beach house, you got something, and so. But where you primarily live, and so her opponent asked the state to look into it. It doesn't seem as though the state has taken any action to like actually investigate that. So it doesn't look like much will come of it in any real way of an investigation, but it certainly has caused reporters and others to ask her that question, as she's been on the campaign trail.
Gotcha. Interesting. Well, we will see what happens, and we're going to keep you posted on the candidates for all the offices in next week's edition of the podcast and in upcoming ones throughout this entire election season. So thank you again for listening, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lounge podcast presented by the Florida Association of School Administrators. Today's podcast was hosted by Michelle White and Jessica Janasiewicz. The podcast was produced by Jeff Willoughby. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. New episodes are released each Monday. For show topics, suggestions, questions, or comments, please email communications@facet.net. We hope you enjoyed the show.